Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. I am Abram Kielsmeyer-Jones. This is Translation Notes, and we are knee-deep in Mark chapter 13. So a warm welcome to you today. As we get started, I want to make sure that you're able to access this handout that you can see here on my screen. That is available to you in the GoToWebinar control panel. You ought to be able to just click where it says handouts, make sure that arrow is pointing down so that it reveals a PDF, and you'll be able to access that that way. You can download it, print it out. It's also going to be sent to you if you're registered for this. If you're here now live, you are also registered, which means you're going to get the handout emailed to you later on today with a link to the recording. So we are recording today's session. If you're watching on a recording and want the handout, everything in this series is right here, tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes, including today's handout. So you can also access it there. That's just a shortcut link to a shared Google Drive that I use for you to be able to access that. You can always email me at abramkj@accordancebible.com. And if you either want the handout or have other questions or observations, I love hearing from folks. All right, today is Mark 13:14, and it is not going to be 13:14 through 23. I've just put that in there as the next section. And today we talk about the abomination of desolation. I have prepared all of one verse for today. If we go past that, that's great. There won't necessarily be notes for it. We could certainly do some live Greek translation if we have time. But verse 14 raises a number of questions, and there are, of course, the questions that arise, such as what on earth is the abomination of desolation, and when on earth is it? But even before that, there are some grammatical challenges that come up and some not so well-known vocabulary. So what we'll do today is kind of a just general overview of where we are in the passage. We'll start with that. And then we'll move into an analysis of verse 14, both the grammar and some of the vocabulary. And for that section, obviously comments and questions are welcome at any time, but for that section, I just want to start with getting the grammar, the vocabulary, the translation down. And then after we've done that, we'll move to the interpretive questions that come up and that even come up via the grammar. So we can't fully separate grammar and translation and interpretation. It all goes together, and we see that actually pretty clearly today. Today's a great case study of how grammar and interpretation go hand in hand. But we'll try to take it in stages today, and I, as always, welcome comments and questions, recognizing that this is a challenging passage, both to translate and to interpret. I think I read somewhere the word that a commentator used in describing the challenges. The word was legion. The challenges are legion in this passage in terms of interpretation. I also noted somewhere an interpreter, and I'll just pull this open to kind of set the stage a little bit. An interpreter that noted Mark 13:30, actually 32, that says, "As for that day or hour, no one knows it, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son except the Father." Now that obviously raises questions around how does the Trinity work, but there is this statement, as I saw some commentator make, of lack of knowledge of some of the details in the timing. So we ought to be encouraged that in verse 32, even the Son is saying that hour, that day, no one knows it. And so that particular interpreter was saying this is actually a controlling verse for the whole passage. Now, whether you agree with that or not, and I'm not sure whether I do, that is in the passage, we'll see it. And so that was just a helpful encouragement to me that I'm not going to, I feel like the more I study this, the more questions arise as to the when of it. And that may even be the intent of the passage. Remember, we talked about R.T. France talking about the call to obedience, whatever happens, whenever it happens. That's really the message of this passage. That's not to say we don't want to study the history and possible future ramifications, and we will, but that's where I've been focusing as I've been trying to understand this passage. All right, so let's review and do a little bit of overview. before we move into today's verse. This was last week. Jesus' speech continued. He says, and whenever they arrest you, remember he's talking presumably to the 4 disciples who have asked him a question. Whenever they arrest you, handing you over to trial, do not worry in advance about what you will say, but whatever will be given to you in that time, this is what you are to say. I think even here, there's a bit of a warning, which is also kind of an encouragement that whatever happens in the future, don't worry in advance about it, because whatever you need or whatever you have to say, that will be given to you in that time. So again, I think however this controls the rest of the passage or doesn't, it certainly does speak to an assurance via the presence of the Holy Spirit for whatever happens and whenever it happens. Jesus goes on, for you are not the one speaking, but the Holy Spirit is the one speaking. Again, very encouraging message in the midst of what's not so encouraging, which is verse 12, and brother will hand over brother to death, and father will hand over child to death, and children will turn against their parents and put them to death or have them put to death. We talked about that last week. Verse 13, and you will be hated by everyone because of my name, but the one who remains to the end, this one will be saved. So again, we've got some more encouragement there. It's kind of sandwiched in between or on top and bottom of this just dire, very bleak picture of the future. Well, it's not that it's bleak, it's accurate if Jesus is predicting it, but it's just a horrific reality to describe. And in the midst of that, the Holy Spirit is the one speaking, giving you what to say, and you will be hated. Also, not exactly a pleasant picture of the future, but the one who remains to the end, this one will be saved. So Jesus, I think, has pretty well fortified his disciples in these last few verses, and they are also now primed to expect any number of predictions in terms of the challenge that the future might hold. And so that's where we get now to verse 14. That's some of the context. Let me just pause and check in with you all. As I say, we're gonna go back to the Greek and the grammar and the vocabulary, remaining as interpretation neutral as possible. Obviously, that's not fully possible, but we're just gonna kind of stick to the grammar and vocab at first. We will broaden back out to interpretation. But let me just check in with you at the outset if you've got questions or comments. Otherwise, we'll just pause for a beat and then we'll jump into verse 14. All right, here we go, verse 14. Yeah, let me put this comment in the chat. Somebody says the disciples is the context, the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. Right, so all of the yous here, whenever they arrest you, handing you over to trial, whatever you will say, you will be hated, but the one implied, the one of you who remains to the end, this one will be saved. This could be a broader statement that goes beyond the 4, but in terms of the immediate context, if we scroll back to the beginning, the ones in this passage, the most immediate referent for you is these 4 right here, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, asking him privately. Again, we don't have any indication from Mark that this speech moves beyond the private realm at any point. It may, and often in speeches, people will overhear and crowds will gather, but all that we have from Mark, I mean, we could speculate, but what we have from the text itself is that they're asking him privately, and he says to them, and this is still part of that. So the most immediate context is those 4. Yeah, so thanks for raising that. All right, let's go to verse 14. I'm going to get a Greek text open here, and you all have your workflow for these webinars already, whether you want to have Accordance open as you do this or just the PDF. Do whatever makes the most sense for you, of course. So here's verse 14. It's in the handout, and I'll do it here in the app. Hatan de idete, tab de lugma tes eremoseos, estekata hapu ude, ha anaginoskon noeto, tate hoi en te iudaya, fugetosan es ta ore. We'll just go left to right here in accordance, and of course we've got the instant details here if we need them, but and or but when you see the abomination of desolation standing, got a participle there, where not it is necessary or it ought not to be, the one who is reading or the reader, third person singular imperative, let that person understand. So let understand the reader, let the reader understand. Then the ones in Judea, let them flee. We've got another third person imperative, let them flee or they shall flee to the mountains. Now we're probably not going to get past this comma today. We may, but just to look ahead, there is kind of an elaboration at this point, and I'll just look at it in English to preview. But what follows now is the one on the roof must not come down or go inside to take anything out of his house. The one in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. Woe to those who are pregnant, pray that it may not be winter. So all of these are further development of this let them flee. In other words, something really bad is going to happen, to use a technical term. There's going to be this abomination of desolation. We'll talk all about that today. But at its site or at its occurrence, those in Judea must flee, and by that, Jesus is implying, I mean this, or here are some other things that other people ought to do. So we'll see this next week will be kind of an elaboration of this week. All the more reason, I think, to spend the extra time on verse 14 to try to understand what is it that is causing Jesus to say, leading Jesus to say, those in Judea must flee, and then all these other specific instructions. And I mean, there's much more. All right, so here's my translation. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. Then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. Let's go word by word. This part, I think, is a little bit easier than some of the interpretation that follows. But we start with hatan. When, it can mean whenever, and it's got a subjunctive main verb following it. So its functioning is kind of a conditional statement. So you could translate it as something like, if you see the abomination of desolation. But as we read this passage, these are not theoretical conditions Jesus seems to be describing. It's not, well, let's just do some scenario planning just in case. It's not a question of if, but of when. So even though it functioned as a conditional statement, BDAG even says hatan can be used with an action that is conditional, possible. I think in this case, this is going to happen. And when it does, do this. We could compare with verse 11 and 7, where we had the same thing. So let me go back to, I'll close this English, and we'll just go back to verse 14. So we have hatan. We can right-click, search for the lexeme, and just go in here and type in range. We can even just do Mark 13 and get right there. So we've got a number of times this word comes up. In fact, this was the question, when are these things, that we got from those four. And then in verse 7, we have hatan with the subjunctive, when you hear of wars. Verse 11, when you, this is what we saw last week, when you are handed over, when they bring you over to trial, when they arrest you. And now again, we've got when you see. And there will be more hatan in the rest of this passage. So it's not just our curiosity, I think, that drives our exploration of this when question. Part of it is this word comes up a lot, so it's important to understand what it means. And we know that words' meanings are determined by context, influenced by context. So hatan can even have different nuances wherever it is. But so far, what we've got is hatan with a subjunctive verb in verse 7, 11, and 14. And it does appear, I raised the question of, is Jesus answering their question, or is he answering a question he wants to answer? It may be some of both, but at the least, Jesus is repeating this word that they asked. So there is a word link in his answer to their question. Jesus can go either way on that. He can answer questions directly, or he can ask a question in response to a question, or he can use a question as a springboard. I think that's still, the jury's still out on that one for me for this chapter, but at the least we've got a semantic link here with hatan. And doing that word search helped us to see not just how it's used with the subjunctive here in verse 14 and 11 and 7, but also that it does go back to verse 4, I think. All right, so there's BDAG on hatan. We could even triple click and see. Let me actually triple click from verse 14 because I think it's got a reference there. Let me know if you have questions about this, but if you have it in your settings, you can have your triple click go not only to your default lexicon, but also the verse that you're clicking from. If that reference is in the entry, it will pull it up for you. And here it is. So we would do well to see that. So it's just saying the aorist subjunctive when the action of the subordinate clause precedes that of the main clause. So the subordinate clause is when you see, then let them flee. So the when you see precedes the fleeing, and that makes sense. That doesn't necessarily tell us when this is going to happen, but this from BDAG tells us that you're going to see something first, and then at that point, let everyone flee. All right, so we don't get a whole lot more from BDAG other than the action is conditional, possible, could be repetitive. This does sound to me like a one-time event. The aorist would seem to suggest that. So I would not translate this whenever you see. I would just translate it when you see the abomination of desolation. Presumably, that's going to be a one-time event, or it's standing there on an ongoing basis, but the first time you see it or hear of it, get out of there. That's how I read this passage. I could be wrong about that. I don't think the grammar is 100% on that, but I think it comes across that way. All right, so what is it that you're seeing? Ta b'delugma, the abomination, BDAG says something that is totally defiling, an abomination, a pollutant. If we triple click on that, and let's just get, I like to, sometimes I'll switch my dictionary over to Mount because he has pronunciations.
B'delugma, b'delugma.
B'delugma, not exactly a word that rolls off the tongue, but there it is. So if we look at this in BDAG, we've got, it could be, and Decker, Rod Decker, I'll mention him a few times today. He points this out too, but he says BDAG gives us something disgusting that arouses wrath, a loathsome thing. And more specifically here, something that is totally defiling, abomination, pollutant. In theory, you could understand this as something like a fly in your soup, but it's much more intense than that here. But the idea is there's something that is it's like oil and water. It's like grounds in your coffee. It's not supposed to be there. It pollutes it. It makes it not pure. It makes the experience not what it should be. So you could understand, I mean, I think defiling, we could understand it that way, but there's also a very sacred, religious cultic sense of the word here, that this is not only unclean, but it's just absolutely appalling that this thing should even be there. It is not supposed to be there. So we've got that from BDAG, totally defiling, abomination, pollutant. Yeah, I just put that second meaning there. It appears to refer to something that is abhorred because it defiles a sacred place and causes it to be left desolate. And that takes us to the second part of this phrase. So if we have the abomination of desolation, That second word, you'll notice there some root similarity to the word for desert, eremos, but this is a state of being made uninhabitable, devastation, destruction, depopulation, and we don't get a whole lot more, but there are some cross references, and we'll explore some of that in a bit. But then when you put those together, you get something like the abomination of desolation. And this is interesting to compare, and again, this still leaves wide open the question, what is that? We'll get to that. I think even in translation, you may consider, is there a clearer way to say this? But the NIV and some others specify this genitive here. So we've got the abomination of desolation, this taste here. What is that relationship exactly? Well, it says the abomination that causes desolation. If you go to live click and just verse lookup, I'm going to click on my verse reference. I'm just going to go to modern texts, and I'll make this bigger. And let me, I'm doing Command plus or Control plus on Windows to make all this font bigger all at once. So we've got abomination of desolation. Here in the Holman Christian Standard Bible, we've got the abomination that causes desolation. Now, the word cause as such is not in Greek, but that is well within the range of meaning of the genitive. It can have that meaning, the abomination that causes desolation. Is a very multivalent word in English. And so what these translations are doing is just deciding to bring that out more. Here's the New Living Translation, which tends to pitch itself at a more readable level. You will see the sacrilegious object that causes desecration. So that's an interesting way of translating abomination. But you'll see a number of other translations give you not just abomination of desolation, but abomination that causes desolation. In my translation, and I'll pause here in just a moment because I'm curious what you think as you wrestle with this phrase and how to translate it. In my translation, I've just left it the abomination of desolation simply because that's one of those phrases in biblical studies, or even just if there's a baseline biblical familiarity, that's a phrase that folks might be familiar with. I mean, it's not exactly John 3:16, but it is true. I've said this before, that translation committees, whether you think this is a good idea or not, they tend to be reluctant with well-known verses or concepts or translations. They tend to be reluctant to move away from that. It's not that they won't, it's just that if you've got something that is so immediately recognizable in English translation, they want to be really sure before they do a different translation. And so even if I think the abomination that causes desolation is a little clearer, and I certainly could be convinced that that's a better translation. In my translation here, I've kept it the abomination of desolation simply because of that phrase being kind of a stock phrase, maybe not out on the street per se, but within the world of biblical studies, and certainly when you start talking about this gospel and the end times and the destruction of the temple, and whenever it is, that phrase you'll see in a lot of commentary. So I've left it that way. But again, you may prefer something like the abomination that causes desolation. And I actually really like the New Living Translation, the sacrilegious object, because that further explains what is an abomination about it. Well, it's the fact that it's sacrilegious, and it's an object, and it causes this desolation. So I like that translation. But this is what I've got. I'm curious if you've got thoughts on this, just the translation piece. I mean, we still need to unpack what it means. But you can see here, even from BDAG, you've got different options here. And the desolation, I think, specifically speaks to, there's a kind of negative set of outcomes that it causes, but there's also a depopulation here makes sense. Because once this abomination is set up, and again, we'll get to that, people are going to flee, as they should, because something is where it should not be, in a holy place. So get out of there. So that abomination causes desolation, not just in the sense of like it devastates everything, but it actually makes people leave. So I think that's useful, uninhabitable. There's multiple ways you could do this. But again, if your translation philosophy is, let's do something consistent with what people might be familiar with, you'd probably go with the abomination of desolation. But certainly there are other options here. Let's just pause there and see if people have comments or questions. Yeah, somebody says, let me put this in the chat. Interesting that the King James mentions the abomination of desolation that was spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Yeah, and that's another consideration too. We'll get into this when we do the biblical context, but you may want to think about, you know, with this referring to Daniel, how is it named there? You know, should, or to what extent should other passages influence our translation of this passage? Generally, I tend to be of the mind that we want to let Mark speak on his own terms, but Mark does not stand in isolation. So there may be a point where the translator says, all right, this is referring to Daniel. How does Daniel name it? Do we want to line them up in a way, you know, that still doesn't compromise the integrity of Mark's Greek? So yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Let me put this comment in the chat. Somebody says, oh, I didn't get all of it. Hold on. Let me try to get all of this comment here. Okay. Somebody says, important, who is the identity antecedent of the subject you of verse 14? Right, and that is in idete. And presumably, I mean, we don't have a marker from Mark that it has changed, right? So the identity of the subject you, plural, occurs in the same verse. The postcedent is actually later in this verse, the one reading. Oh, that's an interesting interpretation. So yeah, so that would actually, if that's right, that would take the context out to the reader. When you, the reader, see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let those in Judea flee to the mountains. And then the comment continues, disciples are dead or gone by 30s through 60s. They will never see any abomination of desolation, past, present, or future. They are not readers of this verse. Yeah, all right, interesting. Yeah, we'll come back to that with the reader, because that really does sort of put an interesting angle into this verse. So yeah, thanks for that comment. I imagine some folks will agree in full or in part, or not agree with that. I'm very open to there being different interpretations to this chapter. But that's a very interesting point, that the you doesn't refer back, but it refers forward to the reader, in which case you, the reader, whenever that is, this is an instruction for them. And that's certainly an interpretation that you would find elsewhere as well. All right, so we've got standing. Now here's the first grammatical challenge, and I hope people are okay with staying on one verse today. Estekata, standing. Now we got to go to our instant details for this. Hatan de idete, when you see tab de lugma, tes ere moseo. So when you see the abomination of desolation, hestekata, standing. If I go to the instant details, or maybe I don't need to, because maybe I've got my paradigm charts still firmly in my head. Perfect active participle, masculine singular accusative. Now the accusative does not surprise, because you've got something that you're seeing, and here with the abomination, that was also accusative. So this horao, taking an accusative verb, it's no surprise. It's just like in English. You see him, objective pronoun, not subjective, you see he. You see her, not you see she. So that's all as it should be, that this would be in the accusative. What is maybe surprising is that this participle is masculine. Perfect active participle, masculine singular accusative. Now, this for me, and this is no knock on accordance or the people who do the morphological tagging, because I have found it to be very reliable, but it is possible that there's a tagging error here or there. Those have happened, and they get spotted and corrected, and hopefully up to date. So my first thought would be, well, let me go through my grammars and my morphologies and see, is this really the parsing of this verb? And I will save the time, but I did spend the time to do that, and I saw, yeah, that is actually masculine, singular accusative. So it's not that there's a parsing error, but what we have is a mismatch between this neuter abomination and this masculine standing. What we would expect grammatically, and let me just see if I can show this with diagrams. We're still in this dependent clause. We haven't even gotten to the main clause is let them flee. This is when, so that this is the dependent subordinate clause. When you see, so here's the neuter, and then here's the masculine, and it's on this same line as the accusative, and it ought to be, at least by expectation, it should match this. It matches it in case accusative. It does not match it in grammatical gender. We've got neuter and masculine here. So the question is twofold. How do we translate it, and why? We will come back to the why and what might be going on here, but in English, we are a little bit saved here. At least we can, we don't have to wrestle as much with the translation decision, because we would just translate it, when you see the abomination of desolation standing. So the participle in English, standing, does not have gender, or even a neuter or an article or anything. So that part's easy. We still do need to decide on the where it should not be, because some translations give us where he should not be. But let's just raise that question for now and note that this is not expected grammatically, that we've got the perfect active participle, masculine singular accusative. It is accusative because it's the object of sight, but why masculine? For now, we'll just note that. And again, this far into the sentence, we don't have to make a hard decision at all. When you see the abomination of desolation standing in English, just the accusative part of that participle comes through. The gender per se, the grammatical gender, doesn't have a way to come out in English translation. So we'll hold off on that. We will come back to it. So to continue, hapu de, where it is not necessary, where it should not be. Now we do have to decide here whether we translate it where it should not be or where he should not be. De is an impersonal, it's a verb that's sort of like, you know what they say, where it's not necessarily referring to a specific person. So it is, in BDAG, you've got to be under necessity of happening, it is necessary, one must, one has to. So whether you use that neuter it or a more personal one, it's not necessarily talking about a particular person in the same way that another active indicative verb would be. That doesn't mean it can't, it's just generally it's got this impersonal meaning of it is necessary, or like if I say you have to, to ride your bike, you have to pump up the tires. I'm not necessarily, I am saying you, but I'm talking about all people. If they want to ride their bike and be safe, they have to pump up their tires. That's an impersonal you. So we could read day that way. Some versions don't, though. They'll say where he ought not to be. And some agree with this and some don't. And maybe this is inevitable. Maybe you preserve it as impersonal. You've got two options here, in other words. Either when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, that's what I favor, or when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he should not be. Now, as soon as you do that, you're making an interpretive decision, which is that the abomination is a person of some kind. And the grammatical support for that would be this standing as being masculine, the grammatical gender. But I think it matching the abomination as neuter makes more sense. We still need to understand the why masculine, so we'll come back to that, but it does connect to this day question as well. All right, let's get into this parenthetical comment. Ha anaginoskon noeto, let the reader understand. So we've just got maybe grammatically one of the easier parts of the verse. We've got a present active participle, masculine singular nominative. So the one who reads, let that person understand, present active imperative. How does this fit into the narrative? It seems pretty clear, at least to me, although as I look at more interpreters, not everyone thinks so. But it seems to me that Mark, not Jesus, would refer to a reader. And we just want to confirm that this is read. I mean, you can do that through BDAG or a word study, but it even says explicitly that is written or inscribed. All right, so if we've established that, and maybe you want to do more of a word study, but it seems that Mark would be the one referring to a reader, not Jesus. So in translation, if that's right, and Decker in his Baylor Greek Handbook says Jesus would have referred to hearers, not readers. If that's right, you just want to make sure that you're mindful of how you punctuate this. The Greek doesn't need to do that because, well, if you think about a Greek manuscript, I mean, there's no punctuation anyway, but in English, you just want to be mindful. When you see, so quote, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, close quote, and then I use M dashes here, but you could use parentheses. Let the reader understand, and then close parenthesis or another M dash, and then begin the quote again, then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. And the question may also arise, well, how do I know when the parenthetical statement ends? I think the tate goes so closely with the hatan that those are connected. So, but when, then, so if that's Jesus speaking, this is Jesus speaking, and this is Mark speaking. Is it possible that this is Jesus still speaking? There is in the SIL Exegetical Summary Series somebody or some translation, let me just see where it is, who is making the parenthetical comment. Most everyone says this is Mark's comment to his readers. This is a minority view, but it's interesting. We haven't gotten to Daniel yet, but this abomination of the desolation, if it's quoting Daniel, you have one commentary saying that Mark is advising his readers that you must read Daniel to understand what is happening. That's a minority view. Mark hasn't elsewhere mentioned Daniel. But there is this one view, this is Lenski, who says this is a comment by Jesus to those listening to him. Jesus parenthetically comments, he that reads Daniel's statement about the abomination of desolation, let him understand. I'm raising that just because there are so many interpretations that I want us to be aware of them, and then obviously you're going to be drawn to one or the other. This may sound far-fetched to you. I think the evidence is lacking here just because Daniel has not been mentioned explicitly, but this is, I do want to raise this as a way to read this passage where this is still Jesus using these words. It could be something broader like, let the one who reads scripture understand, and maybe they know he's talking about scripture by saying abomination of desolation. I think that would click with them. So that's interesting. I can see where that comment is coming from. I think this more widely accepted interpretation is the way to go here. Let the reader understand, so that is Mark kind of interjecting there and speaking to whomever is reading it. That still raises the question, is Mark only talking to his first century readers? Does Mark mean for this to go to anyone who would read it for thousands of years afterwards? Those are big questions, but I think at a basic level, this is Mark kind of jumping into the narrative and saying, let the reader understand. So that's how you would translate it, I think. I think there's an interpretation question to chew on, which is, why does Mark jump in there? It's clearly emphatic and important. So you might just reflect on that or look at your commentaries if you're interested. But let's wrap up this part of the analysis, and then we'll move into the interpretive stuff. we've got tate hoi ente iodaya, fugeto san esta ore, then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. We've got another present active imperative, third person plural. You've got a geographical term here that I think is probably worth some exploration. You may consider whether one of your Bible background commentaries has it. You will find that most commentaries spend so much ink, or ones and O's in this case, as it's coded into a module, on the other issues here, that the Judea one gets kind of short shrift. I think the overarching idea here is let everyone in the region, let everyone, like, get out of there. I think that's the function of this. I think that's how this word is functioning. You might just look and see how this comes up in Mark and consider that. But I don't think Jesus is saying, you know, some people shouldn't worry about this, but he is focusing on Judea, but it is a regional word, as if to say, everyone get out of there. All right, well, that was the easy part. Let's pause there. Just as you take a moment to form comments or questions, which I'd love to hear, just to let you know what's next. We're going to talk now about the abomination of desolation. We're going to look more at this idea specifically of it standing, because we're still not resolved on the neuter and masculine mismatch there. And that will be it. Those 2 points are the main ones. So what is the abomination of desolation? We've got to get into some biblical background here. And what do we do with this? You know, even if we make some progress on understanding this, what do we do with this abomination neuter, standing, masculine? How do we make sense of that? But let me see if you've got comments or questions on just the grammar, the vocabulary of the verse, any phrases here. All right. So let's talk now. Oh, actually, hold on. I do see a comment. And if you, especially if you haven't asked a question or made a comment, I encourage you to weigh in if you are so inclined. All right, so somebody says, let me just put this in the chat. Bear with me. Okay. Somebody says, consider reading can only occur from written context. Typical date given for Mark is written 50s to 67. Unlikely that many handwritten copies could be distributed for this warning by Jesus to be effective to evacuate before Roman destruction by 67 to 70 AD. And likely Mark was traveling Asia Minor during this period. If this was meant as deliverance message for the 70 AD destruction, I doubt it has any effect. All right, yeah, thanks for that comment. Any other comments or questions? We'll move on. All right, let's get into the interpretation a little bit. So I'm as interested in making progress on this question together now in the next 15 minutes as I am in making sure all of us have a sense of how we would make even further progress. And so this kind of combines both in this approach. The IVP Dictionary of Jesus in the Gospels has great material on this phrase and Mark 13. So I mentioned that to you. I've hyperlinked it here. That is one of the first resources I got in accordance, actually back in my Bible Works days. That was one of the very first add-on modules I got, one of the few that they had. So I've used it so much over the years, and because of that, I often forget that I have it, and I was reminded pleasantly of it this week as I prepared. So that's got a great article. I think the easiest way to do any of this is to do a new research search, and I put this in your handout too, but abomination of desolation. Just type that into your research search. You can just search all. It might take a little while to run the search. You could also just search all your tools, but that will get you to the IVP Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. I note here, I probably should have put this first. This is a great time to use research. So you've translated it now, abomination of desolation, or abomination that causes desolation, or maybe you like the New Living Translation. You've got a translation, but now we're going to really study it more. So here's Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. I'm going to open that. So it goes to see apocalyptic teaching, and I'm going to open that. And I've got a great article here on this, and I've got a really interesting, if you thought, well, calling this apocalyptic itself is interpretive, isn't it? Well, yes, and it's also interpretive to say the so-called apocalyptic discourse. I don't know that that's meant pejoratively, but it is an open question of interpretation. So here's that section. I won't read it all now, but yeah, here's where I found the word legion. If the problems involved in tracing the sources of this chapter are complicated, so that's talking about source criticism, form criticism, which is not something we really cover in these webinars. Those involved in interpreting this chapter are legion, and here are a list of only the few of the questions, some of which we've raised. What about these signs? And then it gets into this question: is the abomination of desolation the sign that the temple's destruction is imminent? So that would be that read, and as in the last comment, that's talking about the temple. Or does it have to do with the coming of the Son of Man? Or is there perhaps a baffling multiplicity of signs? Or did Jesus not intend to give any signs at all? So it raises questions and then starts to unpack them. This particular article, this is what I started out the webinar with, talks about how Jesus says even the Son of Man does not know when those days will be, presumably eschatological days. And so that this talks about part of why the ambiguity is here. Now, agree or disagree with that, and I've got mixed feelings about this interpretation, but it does point out this verse as kind of a way of, maybe we won't know either exactly everything. Anyway, there's a lot here, and it does go on to talk specifically about the abomination of desolation, and this is where we get the cross references. And so we won't do this in great detail now, but if you've got a resource in accordance, or you might even just go to the NET notes and you'll get these hyperlinks here. This is where I would start looking at these. So Daniel 9:27. On the wing of abominations will come one who destroys. 11:31, the abomination that causes desolation. I'm just looking at the instant details. Here's another one, the abomination that causes desolation. And then we've got First Maccabees as well, where we've got an historical event of Antiochus IV. It says erecting a pagan altar in the Jerusalem temple. That abomination was an important factor leading to the Maccabean revolt and the overthrow of Israel's Syrian overlords in 164 BC. So if this is in view, then there is a kind of familiar looking back here that this is what potentially what Daniel was predicting. This is noted here. But it could also have other fulfillments, and that's how Jesus would be talking here. So there's a great, this is just a really helpful article. Again, whether you agree or disagree, using your dictionaries, I think, is a good way to go for understanding a phrase like this. Whatever you've got in your research will, whatever you've got in your library will show up in your research search. You might also consider like a Bible background commentary. The New Testament use of the Old Testament is going to be great here because it is going to give you a verse like this in context, but also the abomination of desolation in the Old Testament, in Judaism, and then given all of that, it's going to talk about it in Mark and then theological use. So this is a great article, and I don't know whether you've got these resources or not, but most of your in-depth dictionaries and commentaries will have a separate section or treatment of this particular phrase. But let's just go to NET because that's probably something everybody has, and that's just as good of a starting point. So I'm just going to close this, although those are excellent articles. to consider. Let's go to the NET Bible. All right, so you've got this right here, and if you don't have this in accordance, this is available freely online too. But when you see the abomination of desolation, there's a footnote. I'm going to click it open, and it says that reference is an allusion to Daniel 9:27. So maybe we take this as our starting point, and we can click that open, read it in context. Again, I'm more kind of showing steps we could take rather than actually doing it all right now. The note goes on, though some have seen the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy in the actions of Antiochus IV in 167 BC, that's what we were just looking at. The words of Jesus seem to indicate that Antiochus was not the final fulfillment. And again, it could be a both and. There could be this near proximate fulfillment. So maybe Daniel is predicting 167, but also something else. And that something else is what Jesus is referring to, whether that's in 70 AD or later or both. So it could be, I mean, we could be talking about a multiplicity of abominations here. Some argue that this was realized in 70 AD, specifically what Jesus is talking about. That would be the temple of the destruction, while others claim that it refers specifically to Antichrist and will not be fully realized until the period of the Great Tribulation at the end of the age. Enter the grammar with abomination, neuter, and standing masculine. There are some who read this as, yes, it's unexpected. Let's still give Mark the benefit of the doubt. He knows what he's doing, that's always my approach anyway. And then they go a step further and they say, following something like the NET note here, that the he, as some translations have, understand that this masculine participle is now turning from the neuter abomination and pointing to a person, perhaps an individual known as the Antichrist, often citing 2 Thessalonians 2:3-4 as a related passage. That's just this next note down. You could even see in 2 Thessalonians 3, the man of lawlessness, the son of destruction. He exalts himself above every so-called God, so on and so forth, takes his seat in God's temple. So that's the connection that folks make there to this. So it talks about the grammar here. By grammatical participle, estekata can also be neuter plural. So I said here that it is, and it was parsed in accordance this way as masculine singular. I had to go all the way to Mounce's morphology to confirm this, but this is right. It can be neuter plural. And so what this means is that as this note goes on, just confining the issue to the grammatical challenge, you've got a discrepancy in grammatical gender that we've talked about, masculine singular, but it's modifying neuter singular. Or if this is neuter plural, which is not how accordance parses it, but if it is neuter plural, then it's modifying neuter singular. So you still have to explain that, which some have explained by saying it's the neuter plural that's just kind of referring collectively to a bunch of stuff. You know, the events surrounding the abomination, that's possible. But this particular note is just telling us that one way folks have resolved an interpretation, this abomination standing where he should not be, this masculine here, that it refers to a person. So in that read, and you may change the it to he, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he should not be. Now, other commentators point out, well, yes, but France says Marx de Lugma is standing, not sitting, like the man of lawlessness. So in 2 Thessalonians 3:4, takes his seat in the temple. So maybe that isn't significant enough to deter you from this interpretation. Maybe it is. But in short, what we're looking at is some way to understand how abomination as accusative, neuter, singular, and standing as accusative, either masculine, singular, or neuter, plural, how there is that mismatch there. And I don't know that it has to result in one interpretation or the other, but it certainly has given rise to this idea that the abomination is not just a statue or an image, but an actual person. Decker just has a very simple suggestion here that the participle should agree with the neuter bedelugma, as we've seen, but he says this is a constructio ad sensum. If we don't remember what that is, we can go to File. I might just go to my Pocket New Testament Greek Dictionary, type in that phrase, a construction that is technically ungrammatical but is understood nevertheless. So it may be as simple as Decker says, that, yeah, that's unexpected, it doesn't fit. That doesn't necessarily mean that Mark is saying the abomination is a person or that Jesus is saying that, but others disagree. So I offer these to you, not to try to obscure the meaning, but just to highlight that there are multiple ways of understanding, not even just the time horizon of this, but even the whether this is a person or an altar or a thing. In the end, it is representing something that is anathema to the sacredness of the temple in which it or he stands or sits. I mean, that much is clear, regardless of when it happens. And then so Jesus is saying, this is what you need to watch out for. And then when that happens, get out of there. That's the overarching meaning. You'll even see here Max and Mary just straight up say gender and meaning of the participle favor an apocalyptic interpretation, whereas Decker was saying it doesn't. So again, look at 4 different commentaries and you'll see probably 7 or 8 different views on this passage. Let me just wrap up with this and then we'll leave the last 2 minutes or so for questions. We're still back to this when question, and we've maybe not given a whole lot of attention today to Daniel 9:27. I've tried to point us in directions where we could look at this more. Questions are welcome, but here is the SIL exegetical summary series on when. So you've got this one view that this is what will happen before the fall of Jerusalem. So that's that more immediate so-called preterist view. It's kind of, you know, the read is kind of like take it on the most immediate surface level that you can. You know, if you don't need to go beyond this particular context, then don't. And it's talking about this, and in fact, we have this happening in history. So how do we understand the passage in light of that? That's one possibility here. Another interpretation of this when is a future event. This abomination specifically is a future event when the Antichrist will profane the Holy Temple by taking his seat in God's temple. Again, that's 2 Thessalonians, and by proclaiming himself to be God. That's a possibility. And then another possibility, both. This is the kind of prophetic passage in which 2 events are viewed as if they were but one. It moves beyond the destruction of Jerusalem to the parousia, the second coming, the end of all things, since the 2 events belong together. You've got a couple of interpretations on that. And I will stop there. As I said at the beginning, I think the more I study this, the more I find myself open to various interpretations, but coming back to the big picture question of what is Jesus trying to do with his disciples? What is Mark trying to do with his readers? And I think the answer is something like watch, as in 3:9, we had that blepo verb, beware, don't be anxious. What you need will be given to you. Some terrible stuff will happen. And here's what to do when it does. That's how I'm reading this in an overarching way. It's not to say these questions aren't important. It's just to say they are maybe vexing. You may not agree. You may have a very clear read of this and be very convinced of that. And I honor that as well. But let's stop there. We got all the way through one verse. We can do a little bit of review next time. I've put more in the handout than we were able to cover today. Let me just end the recording, but I'm going to stay on with the rest of you, or all of you who are here live who want to stay on. But if you are watching this and want to reach out, contact information is here.